Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Years ago, I was at a networking event. I go to lots of networking events, but I was at a particular networking event years ago, and you meet people at a networking event, and I came upon somebody. Somebody came upon me. It was a young woman, and it's neither here nor there, but it was a young woman. And right out of the gate, I assume we exchanged names or shook hands. But pretty much the first question of substance was, who's your financial advisor? And yeah, that's not good. But at any rate, you kind of go with it. And I indicated who my financial advisor was and is, somebody I met through AmSpirit Business Connections, go figure. 20 plus years, great relationship. I tell people that if my marriage is going to end, it'll be another woman or me picking another financial advisor. My wife thinks he's just great. My kids think he's great. His name's Eric Thompson. And so we have a good relationship. And that's what I hope for everybody. Not that find your own Eric Thompson or find Eric Thompson, if you will. Happy to introduce you. But at any rate, shared about my financial advisor and my relationship. And her question to me was, what's one thing about your current financial advisor that you dislike? And that was, I know where this is going, right? You're in one of these conversations and you know kind of where this is going. And I really couldn't come up with anything. Again, we really like him. I think what I ended up saying was something akin to, he can't keep straight that I have 3 kids, Lucas, Logan, and Chase, and Logan is a girl. And that name can go either way, depending upon what part of the country you're in. And for the longest time, he was messing that up. Your son, Logan. It's like, no, it's my daughter, Logan. He's got it straight now. In fact, Logan and Eric have their own relationship because she's investing her own money now. But having the question, what do you dislike about your current financial advisor? And if you know me, you'll know that I'm somewhat of a smart aleck, if you will. And I just shared with her, I said, obviously you're angling for me to become your client, right? And of course she answered yes. Figuring, I felt like I was this big marlin on the hook with her, right? Not that I'm a big marlin, maybe a little tuna or something like that. I don't have that much money, but I just felt like she was just kind of reeling me in. She thought she had me. And being the smart aleck that I am, I just said, well, okay, assuming that goes forward 6 months from now, what's the second thing that I'm not going to dislike about you? Implying that the first thing is that she's just a little too forward for me. She was offended. And I make no apologies about that. I was offended. It's just not how a conversation should go. And I just, standing there having this conversation with her, and it's like, really? You're doing this? Who taught you this? What's your next career going to be? Obviously, she's never read the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie's advice. One of many things in that book is ask questions that people enjoy answering. Well, that certainly wasn't going to be a question that I was going to enjoy answering. So it never went anywhere. I've never run into her again. She's probably out of the business. But asking questions, asking the right questions is important. And according to an article in the Harvard Business Review, the most common complaint that people make about conversations or interviews is something akin to, I can't believe that he or she didn't ask more questions or ask any questions. And that's just was a theme that came up in a particular study that was just over and over. Like, when in an interview, I can't believe they didn't ask more questions. I was on a date. I couldn't believe they didn't ask more questions. I was just having a conversation with somebody. Couldn't believe they weren't asking more questions. And so I don't people ask questions. And what today is really kind of a series of conversations, or a series of studies on questions and the importance of questions and how we can use questions to really build our network. But the reasons that they found that people don't ask more questions are really five. One, ego. People want to talk about themselves, right? They do. I have people in my life, if they have a question, it's kind of tee them up for a monologue, right? People like to talk about themselves, and that's one reason. Um, the other reason, second reason, is apathy. People really don't care about others. They really aren't interested. I'm here. I'm here to find financial advising clients. That's why I'm here. Anything else is a distraction. So I don't need to ask questions other than, who's your financial advisor? What don't you like about them? Good. Let's go. Let me reel you in. Um, so the first, ego, apathy. The second is being overconfident, believing they have all the answers. And I think we kind of all we're all guilty of that. We make assumptions about things, and we're not as curious as we ought to be. Um, the fourth reason why people might not ask questions is it's really kind of a defensive measure. I guess it's the way, I don't know how they termed it in the study that way, but I look at it as kind of a defensive sort of a posturing. Um, by asking questions, we might reveal our own incompetence. So, I don't know. I'm curious, but I don't want to ask because I may be the only one who doesn't know that. What I find is, and again, that's something I think we're all probably a little guilty of. Um, I find that by asking questions, most when we ask questions, most people don't are happy that we've asked the question because they don't have the answer either. I was in an AmSpirit meeting, AmSpirit Business Connections meeting last Friday, and there were two IT guys kind of going at it. And what I told the chapter, and I tell lots of chapters, I tell lots of people, is the number one reason why you don't get referrals is people don't understand what you're saying. And so I was getting those two IT people to take it down to a level where the other 15 people in the room could understand. And I said, did anybody understand what they were saying? Of course, everybody's laughing and saying, no, we had no idea. But we're also very polite when we don't want to ask that question. I don't understand. What do you mean by this term? Or how does this work? Or, who would be a good client? Because I don't really understand. Is we don't want to seem silly. So it's kind of a defensive thing. So ego, apathy, overconfident, defensive. And then the fifth thing is undervalue. We just underestimate the beneficial good of just asking great questions. And here's the reality. We can't control what others do. So back to that study where people are saying, I can't believe they didn't ask more questions. The reality is we don't have control what other people do, but we have control over what we do. We have control over our own actions. And so, knowing that questions are important, and I'm going to get into a few other things here, we need to put it upon ourselves to ask questions and be, take the initiative. I remember when I was interviewing for a job when I was in law school, being flown here, there, and everywhere to interview with large law firms. And not really being prepared because I figured they were going to ask me questions and I would get into these interviews and they'd be like, what questions do you have, Frank? And I would kind of chuckle. I don't have any questions. I figured you'd ask the questions. And in reality, if I'd been better prepared and I, for whatever reason wasn't, I was young, immature, I would have came with a flurry of questions. And it's one of the things I've coached my kids on as they get out there and they interview for jobs or whatever it is. Have questions. Come in with a series of questions. Have a notepad. Go through your questions because that allows people to um, maybe exercise their ego a little bit, right? Talk about themselves. What do you like about your job? What do bad days look like? And so always be prepared with questions. But we are totally in control with that. So let me get into some research. This won't be terribly long. I could go on and on and on. There's lots of it out there about questions. But I'll hit some of the high points, if you will. According to research, those who ask more questions uh, let me talk about the study. They did this study and they put people in different scenarios, and in each scenario they were they were tasked with either asking questions or not asking questions. Ask more than 9 questions in 15 minutes, or ask no more than 4, less than 4 in 15 minutes. Well, the people who asked the more questions, the people who were in the 9 questions in 15-minute pool, were deemed to be more likable. Now they did this study in a number of scenarios: interviews, casual conversations, speed dating, everything. The people who asked the most questions were deemed to be more likable. They were more likely to be able to guess on random questions about somebody. So they had these conversations, they asked questions, and then they were given a questionnaire later. What do they like to read? What do they like to cook? What do they like to do for exercise? Information that they didn't have that they didn't have answers to, and they were more likely to come up with correct answers for those random questions, because through the questions they had found information, and that allowed them to better extrapolate what somebody liked to cook or eat, or where they like to exercise, things like that. And then with respect to the dating aspect of it, the people who asked the most questions were more likely to get a second date. So if you're someone here and you're single, just if you're looking, ask questions. It's just it'll serve you well. But asking questions, the number of questions is only one factor, according to the research out there. There's also types of questions, tones of questions, sequence of questions, the sequences of questions, and the framing of the questions. Now, there was a big study out there, and they looked at the types of questions, and they really broke all the questions down into 4 categories. The first is the introductory question. How was your weekend? Right? Kind of what you would start a conversation with. How was your weekend? I ask my assistant that all the time, every Monday. How was your weekend? And we'll talk about our weekends. It's not a passing question. It's just really, how's your weekend? I want to hear about it. And so the first type of question is introductions. The second is mirroring sort of a question. Well, I had a great weekend. How about you? So that's a mirroring question. And then the third is the full switch, completely changing the topic. I'm glad you had a great weekend. How's the Sussex file going? Or how are we doing on this? How are we doing on that? So you're completely changing the topic. I'm glad you had a great weekend. Things are busy here on Monday. Let's roll. And then the fourth type of question is the follow-up question, where you're seeking more information. What do you mean by almost done? That's kind of a follow-up question. What they determined, and I don't think there's any great science to these 4 types of questions: introduction, mirroring, full switch, and follow-up. What they found is that the follow-up questions are really very powerful. I don't want to say the most powerful, but they're very powerful because it doesn't take a lot of preparation. You're kind of on the fly. Okay, you say you're almost done. What does that mean? It's also powerful because these follow-up questions allow you to signal that you're listening. Okay, you told me this is almost done. I caught that. What does that mean? And it also allows you to ask lots of questions. And the people who were in this 9 or more question group really defaulted to a lot of follow-up questions. And it kind of makes sense, because it would seem odd if every question was kind of a full switch question. What do you like to do exercise? What's your favorite Halloween candy? It just would seem weird. So I think follow-up questions really allow us to kind of have that meaningful conversation. So those are the 4 types of questions. As far as tones of questions, what research shows is that people are more forthcoming when you ask questions in a casual way, as something that's really more of a buttoned down, buttoned up official tone. If you are asking things in a casual way versus that official tone, people are twice as likely to reveal sensitive information. And I'm not suggesting it's information akin to what you need to waterboard the normal person for. But people are more forthcoming if they're not as guarded about well, why are you asking? When that tone comes across, it's very official. People become a little more nervous as to how to answer. But if it's casual, how are we coming on that file? Hey, how you coming on that file? They're more likely to answer the question. And then what they also found, is another study, is that people tend to be more forthcoming when given an escape hatch. Hey, can you, um, how are we coming on that project? You know, if you need to get back, think about it and get back to me, great. But what's your gut reaction right now? And people will answer the question, and knowing that they have this escape hatch, knowing that they can come back, they're more likely to answer it. They're more likely to give a complete answer. They're more likely not to fumble over it, and they're very unlikely to come back and change their answer, which I find is very interesting. That even though they have the escape hatch, they don't use that escape hatch. Sequence of questions matter as well. If the conversation is confrontational, intense, um, maybe it's negotiation sort of a thing, you're best served to ask the most difficult questions up front. You know, eat that frog, get that bad stuff right out of the way from the beginning, and then kind of work down into ones that are less confrontational, less tense, if you will. Um, but if the conversation is really about building relationships, the order should be somewhat reversed. You start, hey, how was your weekend? How are we coming on that file? What about this? So on and so forth. And then you kind of build into the more tense topics, if you will. And then as far as framing questions, there are really three types of way of framing a question. There's the yes or no, or the closed ended, just yes or no. And that's not good at getting a lot of information. People can tend to manipulate or be biased with respect to those answers. And people uh, people feel interrogated with those sorts of questions, according to the research. But if you have to ask those sorts of questions, what they advise you to do is your best to frame them in a pessimistic sense versus an optimistic sense. I've got an example here. You're best to say, ask the question, the business will need some new equipment soon, right? As opposed to the equipment is in good working order, right? One's a little more pessimistic than the other. People are just more comfortable, with the, hey, it's bad, isn't it? As opposed to, it's good, isn't it? They're just more comfortable saying, well, it's not horrible, but it's not great either. They're just more comfortable there. So that's the closed-ended questions. Then there are the narrowed option questions, known as multiple choice. And a lot of times these are written, multiple choice, but people might ask a question and give you three options. The problem with the three options or the four options or whatever is, I especially note this in surveys, is that it's like, yeah, none of these really, it might be A, it might be C, can we be somewhere between these two? And so you're kind of forced into answering something, and it's not necessarily where you want to be. It doesn't give a lot of information. You're asked to narrow something down, but it still kind of leaves you a little bit uncomfortable. And then of course there's the open-ended questions. It takes more work, but it's great for uncovering information and learning. It's just asking the open-ended questions. And the last topic I'll touch on here is group dynamics, and that people tend to be less willing to answer questions in front of groups. They just, people are watching. Everybody's, how's the Sussex file going? Nobody wants to answer that in front of people. And the other problem with group questioning is that you ask people and you'll get an answer, and a lot of people kind of mimic that same answer then. I noticed that when I talk with franchisees, I'll get a group of franchisees on a Zoom call, ask a question of one, and then go down the list, and everybody's pretty much got the same answer. But building relationships is less about what you have to share and really about what you get the other person to share. And questions are a great way of doing that. What you need to understand in the gist of this particular program is that you're in control, and you can be in control with respect to the types of questions that you answer or that you ask.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast at amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.